Welcome to the Peace Report. I'm Will Griffin. Today we are going to talk about AFRICOM, specifically about U.S. imperialism in Africa and the whole continent, which is really kind of the next frontier. There is a lot of action going on in Africa, and there is not enough coverage on what's going on in Africa. One of the leading organizations to highlight what's going on there is the Black Alliance for Peace organization, which just is relatively new. And today we're going to have a member of Black Alliance for Peace speak to us about Africa, Netfa Freeman. He is a member, and if you don't know about him, you got to get on this. You got to follow him on Twitter. You got to check out Black Alliance for Peace. So I'd like to just bring on Netfa Freeman now. Thank you for being with us.
So thank you for having me.
All right, so now can you talk to us about what Black Alliance for Peace is, why it formed, and its goals?
Mm-hmm. So Black Alliance for Peace formed, this is 2018. So I think that the end of 2016. And it was really pretty much right after the elections. Our national organizer, Jamu Baraka, who a lot of people know from being the running mate of Jill Stein in the Green Party in the presidential elections. Right after that, him and a number of other people formed the Black Alliance for Peace, for the purpose of recapturing and redeveloping an historic anti-war, anti-imperialist, and pro-peace positions that have been a bedrock of the radical Black movement throughout, its existence here in the United States, and through educational campaigns, organizing, and then of different organizations, member organizations, and individuals. We work to oppose the militarized domestic repression inside of the United States and the policies of destabilization and subversion and permanent war that is the agenda of the U.S. state globally. And so we're, trying to reinvigorate or inject into the peace movement, anti-war movement, the nature of the radical Black tradition.
So recently, Black Alliance for Peace has started a campaign. I believe it's titled U.S. Out of Africa, to highlight what's going on in Africa. I think this is very important. I've been following... Black Alliance for Peace is my main source for getting information on what's going on there. You all provide a lot of good information on this. And I think you've been leading the way, and I've been trying to support and highlight your work as much as possible. But can you talk to us a bit and explain what this campaign is all about?
Right. I mean, I would say the Black Alliance for Peace, maybe it would be good to say we're leading the way. We're not the only ones. I don't know if you meant me as an individual, because I'm not leading the way. That we do have an Africa team and a couple teams, a research team, which we do a lot of collaborative work. And so, and we really appreciate the Peace Reports production of that video on AFRICOM and the use of our resources for that. Is a really good piece of work, which we actually used Pan-African Community Action, my organization, used yesterday in our public education session.
Very cool.
But yes, the campaign is U.S. Out of Africa, Shut Down AFRICOM. And what we are trying to do is, one, bring attention to the proliferation of AFRICOM and the U.S. Africa military presence in Africa, and also we confront the powers that be about their use of this. People might, and like your video did, and how our fact sheet describes, beginning in 2007 was the announcing of the intention of AFRICOM, the U.S. Africa Command, and then it was launched or tried to be launched in 2008. This was the George Bush administration, and it was widely rejected across the African continent in terms of them trying to establish the headquarters of AFRICOM on the African continent. All of the African leaders roundly rejected it, led a lot by Libya and Zimbabwe, and a couple other African nations. And so they weren't able to establish a headquarters in Africa. They ended up establishing the headquarters in Germany. And then in 2008, after the election of Barack Obama, we saw a proliferation of military presence in the form of personnel, in the form of military to military relationships, U.S. military to military relations with African countries, small bases, things like that. Really it just took off from that time. And so now we're seeing where AFRICOM has a strong foothold in all but in terms of military bases and military to military in all but South Africa, all countries but South Africa in some form or another. And these may be, I mean, we could say that because of the power of the United States, a lot of it is said to be even against the will, could be even against the will of the African leaders. It's a hegemonic force, which has a lot of ways to leverage its power and its influence. And so now, we're seeing a lot of things, even we've seen a lot of things and we're seeing a lot of things. Even the use of drones that are doing wreaking havoc and destruction on the continent of Africa and other places and housing drone bases there, where we've seen the decimation of Libya as a country and that the country that led the way really against to oppose AFRICOM and U.S. Military presence or hegemony in Africa. And so we see this really as the U.S.'s agenda as to dominate the globe, and particularly as a new scramble for Africa. We're seeing a lot of interest in trying to different countries trying to gain influence over what happens in the development of Africa and access to natural resources and those things. U.S. approach is a typical approach of dominance through force. And we see AFRICOM as their attempt to compete for the influence over Africa and the access to resources and things with China, with other countries. And this is their way of doing so.
Yeah. So no, 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 that was great. So for the people who are watching, share this video right now. And also, we'll be taking questions. If you have any questions for Netfa, just put it in the comment section, and I'll ask him. He'll be happy to answer those questions. But first, I want to go to. Let me bring up this the website, because you have demands. You have 4 demands on your website on this U.S. out of AFRICOM. And basically, it says 1. The complete withdrawal of U.S. forces from Africa. 2. The demilitarization of the African continent. 3. The closure of U.S. bases throughout the world. And 4. The Congressional Black Caucus must oppose AFRICOM and conduct hearings on AFRICOM's impact on the African continent. So I know for the video I made, I based it off of the timeline sheet that Black Alliance for Peace made. For the people watching, you should check out that timeline. I think it is very important to see what's going on with U.S. imperialism overseas and in Africa. One of the major facts it showed was that it's only been 10 years, just now over 10 years since AFRICOM was established. And in that time period, there has been a 2,000% increase on U.S. military presence on the African continent. And I think that speaks volumes to what the U.S.'s intentions are in that place. But there's also, someone else is talking about right now about China in the live stream. And I want you to, if I could get you, Netfa, to talk about, because there seems to be this battle right now between China and the U.S., developing a larger presence on the African continent, but I feel like they're doing it in different ways. But anyways, can you talk a little bit about what China and the U.S. is doing there?
Right. And I think this is an interesting thing because it creates for people of African descent or for any peace and justice loving people a false dichotomy, as if we have to choose between one, or as if our stance against AFRICOM in some way is either in support of what China is doing. Now, one thing that China is not doing is the proliferation of their military bases all over the country. China has not decimated a country like as if like the U.S. has done with Libya, completely destabilizing it, and then actually instigating the formation of all of these very extreme violent groups on the continent. And so, one, as people, a lot of our members, being people who are in the United States, have citizenship in the United States, whether we subscribe to being American or not, which I personally do not, feel that our primary responsibility is to look at the United States. China's role in Africa is primarily an economic one. We cannot point to, as far as I know, instances where, like with the United States, where they have aided in coup d'états, like in Mali and in Burkina Faso recently, through the training of AFRICOM training to their what they call the Africa Center for Strategic Studies, which is like the School of the Americas for Africa, and where they're training people, military personnel who actually partake in the destabilization of the continent. And so where China is, people could argue, well, it's about their interest and how they're doing it. They're not a friend of Africa. These things are irrelevant to us, whether they are. We know that countries operate on their own interests when they have international relationships, and it should be the ability for Africa to have, in terms of self-determination and whatnot, to have the ability for many different relationships with different places without being given an ultimatum by any one or the other. I don't. So that's one thing. So the U.S. kind of puts out this narrative. So everything is mostly economic, and people even argue that could argue that China and its construction things there and its projects are helping aid the infrastructure. Some people argue that it's not really as much as it's being said to be, and that it's more for their own interests and to facilitate their economic commerce and those kind of things with Africa. The same thing could be said to the U.S. So it doesn't really. What is important for us is at this stage in the game, and particularly U.S. imperialism, is the militarization of the globe, and particularly in Africa through AFRICOM. And the only way for Africa really to have the freedom to be able to set relationships on their own terms is for things like for the United States type of agenda. There's really nothing but dominance. It's nothing but full spectrum dominance is what their agenda is, in spite of what they say to stop terrorism and to stop drug trafficking. We know these things are not real, and we also have to respect and then people will say, well, African leaders are creating these relationships with China, and they're not doing it in the best interest of the people. Well, we also know that any relationship with the United States is not done with the best interest of the people. It's done to extract the raw resources and sell back to Africa, which is the richest continent in the world in terms of mineral resources, and sell back the finished goods to them, not allowing the capability to manufacture and to refine goods. And so this is the history of the United States with Africa. China has a different history with Africa in terms of, if we go back to the independence and Africa's struggle against colonialism and for decolonization and for independence. It was China was only one place in which African liberation movements could find some sort of support, regardless of what kind of conditions may have been put on that. It doesn't matter. We needed African. I say we because I identify as an African person. I use Black and African interchangeably as a Pan-Africanist. We needed some alternatives. We knew, if we look at the history, and this is actually a good segue into how African people in the United States are treated. I think African people, if we consider people, even those who consider themselves African Americans, really would do well to look at the historical conditions that characterize or define the relationship between United States and Africa, and even determining the relationship between China and Africa. If we just look at the 50s and 60s, and I hope I'm not digressing from the question, but if we look at the 50s and 60s, U.S. government relationship, I won't say with the people, but even, different formations, U.S. government relationship with our movements inside of the United States for civil rights, for Black power, and some would say for decolonization, which we should consider it that also, was met with met with repression. The FBI, and people know about the FBI's COINTELPRO, the counterintelligence program, which demonized our movements here that were really trying to fight police repression in our communities, which assassinated leaders and railroaded people into prison and all kind of things. This is what the FBI did. At the very same time, in the continent, when the continent was gaining its momentum in terms of a unified African continent and decolonization and independence, the CIA, the international counterpart of the national security state of the U.S., was doing the exact same thing on the African continent, plotting coups d'etats, overthrowing the leaders. And so this is, consistent. I would just, without necessarily speaking for everybody in the Black Alliance for Peace, just speaking for myself and maybe my organization that's a member of BAP, one member organization, we assert that if we don't see ourselves as one people, our enemy certainly sees us as one people, and they treat us the same no matter where we are, and we should understand that. And so when we were looking for assistance against the capitalist imperialist agenda, the establishment of international finance capital on the continent through trying to reestablish colonialism in the form of neocolonialism, all the trappings of independence and all the look of independence, but still looking having to depend externally for our economic sustenance and those relationships. We found allies in support of our liberation movements in China, in the Soviet Union, and other places. We also, which I think is time for us to reconsider, were able to form what was called, be part of forming with those other countries and places, other continents that were colonized, the non-aligned movement, which said we're not going to be beholden to in the Cold War paradigm of, well, you're with the West and capitalism, or you're with the East and the Soviet Union and Russia. We said no, we have our own agenda, and we'll deal with each on our own terms. And this is what we have to establish now. And we have to be careful of these arguments to try to keep interjecting China as the primary enemy anytime we raise up the United States, because it's the United States argument. It's the United States propaganda that tries to tell us that their enemies are our enemies, and that because they are in economic competition with China, then we should be wary of China, when it's actually the United States that we must, I think, be more wary of, because its relationship with Africa brings death and destruction. They support dictators like Museveni and Uganda and Rwanda. I'm blanking on in Rwanda, different places, a destabilization of Congo. I mean, these are the kind of things that we can expect, and we have to be very clear that this is the same agenda from back then, exists today, and we should determine our own enemies, and we should figure out on what terms, what is the best interest of us internationally, and how to understand that.
So if you're just joining us, we're speaking with Netfa Freeman from Black Alliance for Peace. They just started a campaign called U.S. Out of Africa, Shut Down AFRICOM. They're highlighting U.S. imperialism on the African continent. I wanted to read this quote that I first learned about this quote, and it's a meme now that came from Black Alliance for Peace. It's the quote from the Deputy Commander of AFRICOM in 2008 named Robert Mueller. And the quote goes like this: "Protecting the free flow of Africa's natural resources to the global market is one of AFRICOM's guiding principles." And you touched on this earlier, saying that Africa is the richest continent. And you know what? I think there are people around the world that do know this. I was in the UK earlier this year, and there was a relatively young woman who was an academic, and she was saying that Congo should be the richest country in the world right now, but due to its exploitation, it's one of the poorest countries in the world right now. And I've heard Maurice Carney speak to this at conferences, talking about this whole green revolution that's coming upon us right now about uh, using all these products that we use, from cell phones to computers to the cameras to the rocket launchers. They all use resources like coltan and cobalt, which mainly come from Congo and is completely being exploited. So people who are pushing this whole green revolution, a lot of them are completely unaware about the slave labor that's going on and the exploitation that's going on the African continent to get these resources. But as this exploitation continues, you also touched on this idea of how when COINTELPRO, counterintelligence program, started, I did a video on that as well, talking about the history behind it and how it was exposed through direct action of breaking into an FBI office and stealing literally thousands and thousands of documents. And they kept seeing this word COINTELPRO and had no idea what it was about. And that was an FBI program, but at the same time, the CIA overseas is doing all these horrible things around the world. So can you talk a little bit more about why, I don't know what you call, Africans in America or Black Americans, why they should be concerned about what's going on with the CIA and the connection to the FBI and what's going on the African continent and how it affects them?
Mm-hmm. Well, one thing is it's interesting because there's this memo that and it's being said to be unauthentic, not really authentic. It's called the Memorandum 46, and it's on the website of the Final Call, the National Advantage Final Call, and it's entitled in the U.S. Black. It's Black U.S. No, I'm sorry, Black Africa and the U.S. Black Movement. And it is asserting that if it's whether it's authentic or not, I think is still be instructive to read, and we can see whether it's authentic or not. The policies that are being leveraged against both African people here and in Africa seem to bear out that this it seems to be a policy, whether that memo is outlining it or not. And I think that the reason why we should be concerned with what happens on the African continent is because we really, Malcolm X put it very, very plainly, is that we can't, as people of African descent, gain any kind of respect, any type of regard without a strong Africa. That we actually have our destiny is inextricably tied to the well-being, economic and political strength of the African continent and vice versa. And so we have to kind of organize ourselves transcontinentally so that we're not in this position of being the most poorest and repressed people around the world in every country where people of African descent are, yet come from the continent that is the richest in resources, and none of those resources or the assets that the continent of Africa has are being used for the upliftment or the benefit of the people themselves, wherever they are. And so if we look at this, like I referred to that memo because it outlines and says things that one of the policies that should be engaged in through the agencies like the CIA and FBI is to make sure there's no political connections between our movements, African movements, Black people movements in the United States and the movements on the continent of Africa. And while we know we can't really say for sure whether this is a leaked memo, whether it's authentic or not, I don't have that information. We do know for sure that measures have been taken, like, for example, the CIA following Malcolm X in Africa, trying to poison him and different things like this. This has been a policy. We don't see any assistance or any kind of letting alone when it comes to us trying to forge the Black Panther Party. A lot of them went into Africa and were trying to forge connections with liberation movements on the ground and became targets of COINTELPRO as a result of their activities. People, the white supremacist basic narrative of the United States is that what undermined the Black Panther parties because they were deranged, violent-seeking type people, but that wasn't it. It was about things like trying to making sure our young people could feed, ourselves, that we could, give them meals and stand up against police repression. Really, it was the Black Panther Party for self-defense. And the same thing happened on our continent when you have the first country, Ghana, with the Ghanaian independence, Ghana, and establishing a socialist project there, which provided universal health care, universal education to the best of its ability, a fledgling independence movement, and actually influencing different countries across the continent. Whereas actually we were very on the precipice of establishing a United States of Africa before the undermining of this project by various forces that didn't want to see it external to Africa. And so while this is one of the reasons, these different things are why we should be concerned with what happens on the African continent. If we look at, and one of the things I'll say this is that another comparison, and along this more contemporary than the COINTELPRO FBI's assault and then the CIA's projects during our independence, is the militarization of our communities. So AFRICOM, we assert in Black Alliance for Peace that AFRICOM needs to be seen as the counterpart to the 1033 program. And if people are not familiar with the 1033 program, it's that program that establishes a law. It was signed into law by Bill Clinton in 1997, I believe, that authorized the transfer of all types of military equipment to local law enforcement. And we've seen this equipment being used against resistance forces. Really, this is what it is, like in the Occupy movement, and also against the rebellions in response to the murder of Michael Brown. But they're saying that they're for other reasons, and they're also being used just regularly on a day-to-day basis with SWAT raids and things in our communities, Black and brown communities. And so when the intensification, when the U.S. settler colonial project and capitalism, international finance capital, becomes even more unsustainable as a means of providing things for everyone, it becomes more desperate to usurp and resources and things like that. We bear the brunt of what happens with that, the fallout, whether we're here in the United States or whether we're on the continent of Africa or whether we're in Colombia, South America, or wherever we are, Haiti. And so we that's why we have to be concerned. We have to broaden our purview so that it's international. We have to have a Pan-African purview, and this doesn't preclude being against any other people. I mean, I think it's the only way we can forge real connections with other people, is to really have a good grounding of us in terms of our commonalities with people of, being of people of African descent, but then also being internationalists, being, humanists, that we will forge also connections and commonality with other peoples who are facing the hegemonic maneuvers of the United States and other imperialist countries or nations, and the multinational corporations and all that, which actually run all of this stuff.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that for sure. All right, so if you're just joining us, we have a lot more people joining us right now. We're talking with Netfa Freeman from Black Alliance for Peace. This organization is running a campaign right now, U.S. out of Africa, shut down AFRICOM. They're highlighting a lot of U.S. imperialism on the African continent as a whole. Check out their website, blackallianceforpeace.com. So you spoke about the 1033 program, which I think is very important. A lot of veterans, or I should say the anti-war or anti-militarist or anti-imperialist veterans, have been really trying to highlight the 1033 program, which again is the transfer of military equipment and even training to local police forces here in the U.S. So, that is a direct connection of U.S. foreign policy to domestic policy. Everyone should check that out for sure. In the timeline, again going back, I think this is really important. In the timeline that Black Alliance for Peace came out, the 10-year timeline for U.S. AFRICOM, it said, there was a 2,000% increase in military presence there. Now, I got to say, personally, when I'm meeting more and more veterans, I got out of the military 8 years ago. I'm meeting more and more veterans who have been to Africa. And it's like, we see that even when they get out, some of them are joining the anti-war community or anti-war movement. And I'm just seeing a lot more people who've been to Africa. And a lot of them don't really even understand the true depths of what they participated in. and because to a lot of, especially the, I'd say like just regular veterans, not the anti-war veterans, they think they're just saying, oh, we just trained people, that's all we're doing over there. So I think what Black Alliance for Peace is highlighting is super important. um, I want to talk about a little bit about pop culture real quick. I know this may surprise you, but anyways, this is big. I think. Well, have you seen the movie Black Panther?
Yeah.
Okay, so there, there's
I actually saw it when it first came out, and I happened to be hanging with Jamu Baraka, so we saw it at the same time for the first time.
cool, very cool. I wonder, what do you? So first of all, I think there's two different sides that I've heard. Um, One is that one, it's great that there's a blockbuster Hollywood movie featuring black people, right? Or Africans. And the other side is that, well, this is a horrible way of showing, like, one, it like highlights a monarch, a monarchy. Two, it shows the CIA as this good force around the world. What are your thoughts about this movie, Black Panther?
Right. How do I keep it short? So I mean, I think the monarchy part is probably the least of, because it is fantasy, and then there is, we could go back and say there's something to be said about the difference between monarchy, historical monarchies in Africa. It's that part is less, but that is a issue. And since it was a comic, it's a comic book that had its a book story and character has a history. I wouldn't be so, but for them to come and make a movie out of it, and actually even the from my understanding, so I actually have I don't know, a comrade or a friend of mine named Todd Stephen Burrows. I got to plug Todd's book, and he's a comic book geek, and he wrote a book called Marvel's Black Panther. Oh gosh, Marvel's Black Panther from Reginald uh, oh, I can't remember. No, from Stan Lee to Ta-Nehisi Coates, and it's from Robert. And so he actually tracks the history of this, and so he follows this, and also unpacks the political implications of the evolution of the story and who the different writers were, because they had different writers from it. But anyway, let me just answer your question first, and then I'll go to what he kind of lends to this thing is that it's very problematic that we have one uh, um, Chitala and Wakanda was this very insular country, and you saw his woman. She was his wife or his girlfriend was like the only one doing things in the rest of Africa. Trying to do and everything. They were insular, not really dealing with all this technology and imperialism going around, and they not even trying to affect any of it, right? Until Killmonger comes, the character, and he's Milan. He's like, and these are not how these, from my understanding, are not how these characters were developed before. This is a new depiction that they put on this with them, and so and I can't remember. It wasn't Ta-Nehisi Coates. I'm blanking on the person's name who wrote this particular one, but he writes for the comic. The books, the series that they have now. But anyway, so Killmonger, who actually had this Pan African view, an anti-imperialist view to stand up for it, was kind of depicted as deranged person. Even when they were, and even his father, who was in L.A. and whatnot, it's the same way they depict the Black Panther Party all the time. It's this caricature view of it. This doesn't have any real political theory or analysis about the world, and it obscures its principles of, and for doing for self and self determination. It doesn't deal with any of that. It just makes them seem like they're black power or whatever. And that was kind of how they depicted this person.
And they named him Killmonger.
But that also was still a character in the old things. It wasn't like they made that up. And in and so those are the stark, interesting differences. And so the Wakanda, they, instead of them making allies with the west of the African nations, there was also a little thing in there where you see something that's like in the beginning of at the beginning, it's Boko Haram, supposedly, where his girlfriend or his lady or his woman partner was going and trying to stop the trafficking of these women. But that's not really explained. There's no historical context. I'm not saying that the story should do that, but it happens too much for us, as if we just inferior people and all these things are happening on the continent of Africa. We killing each other, trafficking women, and all that, and there's no context to that, which we can see the formations like Boko Haram and others are actually a product of U.S. hegemonic projects that predate them. And so it's a destabilization. They're a product of destabilization on the continent. And those kind of things are not put into context ever for us. So you have that. You have them aligning with the CIA to help stop, Killmonger and other kind of things. There's some symbolism of the CIA person shooting down a plane before it goes out and tried to, you could say, is symbolically spread Pan-Africanism. The idea of Pan-Africanism in that is you could say is subliminally maligned in the country in the movie. At the end, he goes to the United Nations and is talking about sharing Wakanda's resources with the world and everything. Not the African Union, but the United Nations. And one of a comrade of mine, Jared Ball, talks about how it's kind of he remembers when Patrice Lumumba was speaking at the United Nations and was talking about, chastising the colonialism and all that kind of stuff, and he got assassinated. So he comes and he's speaking to the United Nations about sharing, the wealth of Wakanda and whatnot to a body that we actually must admit is dominated by, by NATO. I mean, these forces by these, Western hegemony, and so, and a large extent, or at least is, and so that there's a whole lot to unpack there. It's just like we don't, subliminally, the message to any young person or whatever who doesn't know any of these histories is that anything like Pan-Africanism is a wild and extreme idea, and the benevolence of the West is really there, even though they say, well, Killmonger was created by them in terms of he was a veteran or whatever, he was on these missions, but it still doesn't show that that's the nature of the whole, the U.S. military. That's what it is. It's not a Department of Defense. It's a Department of Offense and Domination. And that's what it is. So you don't get that from there. I mean, it's just a whole lot there. But then one thing, and I'll just say the end on that, is that because one of the things my Todd Stephen Burrows, who wrote the book, and I recommend people read this book, on that, is also turned me on before Black Panther Party movie came out about a BET cartoon series, six parts that was squashed to sat on, but right now you can get it on YouTube. Six parts that actually give a really good depiction of like colonialism and the imperialist powers, all the NATO forces, and we're kind of trying to have to fighting that back. It's very interesting. It's a starkly different.
What's it called?
It's just the Black Panther. It's the cartoon Black Panther Party. It's a Marvel cartoon of them, but it's a short 6 parts. They're about 20 minutes each or 6 parts because it was supposed to be on BET television, but they sat on it, and I kind of think they never really released it, but now they have it on YouTube because they released it after the movie, and it actually shows, it has supervillains depicting each different aspects of the colonialist powers. France, the Catholic Church, the United States, as Condoleezza Rice and with them in the Oval Office trying to talk about dominating and invading Wakanda is really good. The fight between the Black Panther and Captain America, I mean, it's much more real and entertaining in that regard. That you know why Reginald Hudlin, that writer of it, didn't really, I guess, he didn't last long, and they weren't going to use his depiction of it in any kind of blockbuster movie.
Wow. Yeah. So I didn't hear about that. I'll check that out on YouTube soon. I'm interested in that. So if you're just joining the live stream, we're talking with Netfa Freeman from Black Alliance for Peace. They started a campaign, U.S. out of Africa, shut down AFRICOM. They have been highlighting U.S. imperialism on the continent. They provide a lot of vital information that you all can follow. Check them out at blackallianceforpeace.com. So we have a question. We have a few questions. The first one is from Mr. Baraka himself. Thanks for joining us. He asked, why aren't there more elements of the Black community more involved in anti-imperialist work?
That's a good question. Before I do that, I want to just make a plug. We have a petition for the Shut Down AFRICOM campaign that we asking people to sign. It's the first step in getting involved in the campaign. It's, if you can reach it, the short one is tinyurl.com/shutdownafricom. And so we need people to sign that petition. This is just one part of our campaign, and the petition will be directed to the House on Foreign Services Committee and the Congressional Black Caucus with the demands that you named. And so we really need people to take that first step. And there's a checkbox where you can actually leave it checked, and we'll have your information, and you can actually join the campaign, or you can uncheck it if you really want to remain, not part of that. Then that's your choice. But we really hope that you check it so you can be involved with us. In answer to Jamu's question, I kind of have to theorize about that, and I think one of which we just talked about, pop culture, sort of doesn't give us any type of gleaning into that, and kind of dissuades us from that in so many ways. I think the radical Black tradition, in terms of our movements back then, also that was assaulted and attacked by the United States, which a lot of it had an implicit, had a Pan-Africanist nature to it, and an anti-imperialist nature to it, which is what all of what Black Alliance for Peace stands for, was how it was decimated, so to speak, or really attacked. And then also we have people who were put in high places, like Congress people and all that, mayors and all that, with sort of the effect of having us believe that we share the same interests as United States, as I call it, Americanism. And so something like imperialist adventures and different assaults are not on the purview. Even when people are not in agreement with wars, they assume that wars are something done because they're misguided policies in response to something for good intention and whatnot. And these are just not, things. So, for example, you'll see people say in response to something like Saddam Hussein, or even with Libya or something, that wasn't the right thing to do. They should have gone into negotiations. There's a negotiated political solution. Well, what solution to what? What is the actual problem here? Is the problem these other countries that they're coming to assault, or is the problem that they are trying to dominate, and they should just leave countries alone and mind their business, and we should have more of a cooperating type of scenario when it comes to international politics. And so people adopt these narratives where they believe, and Kwame Ture was one that had this quote that used to say, a lot of people, it's whites. I don't know if he used the word white supremacy, has us believing that the particular history of Europe is the general history of the world. And I would go as far as to say that also means that the particular interests of the Western world, of the United States, of white supremacy, are the general interests of the world. And so we can all of the propaganda teaches us of this, and it doesn't help us learn things about our history of resistance to domination, to exploitation, to repression, and the thinking, the epiphanies, the revelations about the world that have come out of that. So we don't really know about these things, and then there's so much right now to distract us from things that are talking about imperialism and those kind of things. When it comes to the media, the means of media and propaganda have become so sophisticated that they can confuse people, even when people have good intentions or almost on the right track. They fall short of assuming that the United States intentions, even when they're doing the wrong thing, are good, and they're just going about it the wrong way, when it's just that could be no further from the truth. So that's my initial answer of it. So it's a complicated question he asked. It's a very good one, and that we need to, like, for example, and they have us more towards. I think there's a culture of sensationalization. The news kind of goes to that too. So even when we engage in movements, we're doing a lot of mobilization, but not thinking about protracted organization. So when a cop kills somebody, or we see this, what seems to be a rise, or it gets caught on video, we want to mobilize and demand things like that the police stop doing this, or the cop be brought to justice, or whatever, and we don't connect it to like what we were talking about earlier, is with what's happening on AFRICOM, as it being part of a broader, not only agenda, but a trajectory where the natural consequences of neoliberalism around the world, and also, which only can give austerity and those kind of things. Anyway, that's my theory.
I mean, that's a great answer. I want to ask your personal thoughts on the electoral political system. It's the midterm season. Yeah, exactly. So, I mean, I think it doesn't get spoken about enough about how, because I mean, I think most of America is they say, hey, I went to the voting booth, I did something, right? And there are people who are just like, I'm not voting, I don't believe in this system, right? And anyway, so can you speak about what your thoughts on the electoral political system, about the upcoming elections, and how that may or may not affect U.S. imperialism abroad, specifically on the African continent?
Oh wow. I think it's a good question. I actually was thinking of it on the way over here because I was hearing on the radio station that I actually have a show on this. We gotta vote, and these are my colleagues who I, appreciate, and they're good people. We gotta vote as if we're shirking our responsibility. We're being irresponsible by not voting, but there's no discussion on how. Uh, what type of change we need and how the utilization of the vote and electoral process should be leveraged, as if with just voting, like you said, is isn't of itself enough. And then we're taught that from a very early age. Especially people of African descent, your ancestors died for you to have the right to vote, and this and that. And so it's like kind of guilt tripping us into it. But then those same people will not acknowledge that. I mean, if you vote, whether you vote for a Republican or Democrat, you're voting for white supremacy, and capitalism and imperialism and all those kind of things. We want to make we should make the elections a critical issue, and I think this the masses of the people do. And then Black Alliance for Peace, definitely we need to have. So when they come to talk about what are the primary issues that candidates need to take a position on, which should inform our vote, we don't really get those primary issues. We get other stuff. We need to have issues like, what is your position on AFRICOM? What is your position on the military budget? The fact that a military budget was approved that really, I mean, how much is it now? It's $700 billion or something, $800 billion. What is your position on that as a candidate? And the fact that we're fighting for things like health care and those kind of things, and always told there's no money for that. I mean, these are the kind of things that really should be at the forefront of the conversations around elections, and forcing the candidates to take positions on them. Right now, the media makes us believe that the position we're it's almost like it's tail wagging the dog. We They tell us what the issues are and who the candidates are, and then we follow that, and we keep having to we think that those are the issues that we need to understand, and we need to force them to talk about, when there are so many other issues that directly impact our day-to-day lives and our survival. And so I think right now the two parties, as Republican and Democratic Party, will they all support some of the major things that they support, that they agree on, are not part of our lexicon. They're not in our world. The military bases around the world. This It's assumed that U.S. military bases around the world are a good thing, or not even talked about. I don't even know if people know how many military bases are around the world. And so, these are the kind of things, and though both parties are in agreement of that, both parties will say that, like, Cuba needs to quote unquote be more democratic, and the kind of propaganda they have about whatever kind of countries. Um, and so, and these are the kind of important things. Both parties will say things like the police in the United States are doing a good job and they need to be supported. It's just we need to, hold some accountable and have civilian review boards and all that. They won't say with the communities need to have control over public safety and decide what police force is in their communities. That's democracy. I mean, that's what real democracy is. And so we need to make these kind of things, lift them up in terms of being electoral, campaign points and platforms. We need to really talk about them. Like right now they're talking about socialism, but it becomes like it's obscured what that means, and not and all of them. Everyone's not talking about it. So some of the socialist candidates now open that space being opened up by Bernie Sanders. And I'm not trying to malign anybody. Let me put it, but we have to be clear about that. We cannot bring about an equitable distribution of wealth, a more democratic society in terms of policies, like people being able to have says on stuff, through parties that represent capitalism and imperialism. So if you're a socialist, you're not going to be part of the Democratic Party. It's just that simple. As you can't. They're not going to, like Malcolm X said, a chicken cannot lay a duck egg. capitalist imperialist party is not going to produce socialism. It's just not. And so, so we have to create a formidable thing. We don't say that people should abstain from the elections, but we understand when people do because they don't see, and they shouldn't be maligned as people who are apathetic or whatever. They know if people believed that going to a polling station and voting for either a referendum or a candidate would radically transform their conditions, they would go in droves. So when people are not going, and we have like only a little over 50% of the people participating now. Before the election of Barack Obama, was always less than 50% that actually participated in the electoral process. So when they're talking about the electorate, they're only counting the those registered voters. They're not talking about percentages of the population. And so that large percent of the population is a reflection of something. It's not a bunch of dumb people or whatever. I mean, that's looking down on people when we think that's the reason why. It's because the conditions are so dire for them and that they see no difference, that people don't participate. So once we raise these things up, like stop war, close all U.S. military bases, and take that money and put it into universal health care, not affordable, what is it called, the Affordable Care Act, but universal health care. That money could pay for health care for everybody in this country, and some people in other countries. It could probably help significantly deal with education, universal education, all the way up to the college level. There are countries that do this. They have much smaller budgets, national budgets, than the United States, and actually they spend a whole lot less on military too. The United States does not have the threat. U.S. national security, the threat to U.S. national security, has to be seen uh, by in the eyes of the disposition, the hegemonic and dominant disposition that stance it takes in the rest of the world. If the U.S. was not having this dominating stance, this militaristic dominating and economic dominating stance to the World Trade Organizations and all these international finance institutions, then the threat would be a lot less, if not non-existent. And I'm not really sure how much some of it is so much of it is blown out of proportion in the first place. And so I don't know. That's my take on election.
Okay, so I think there's been this initiative. I don't know if it's a campaign, but it's hashtag anti-war autumn. I just want to read. You basically, I think you kind of explained it. You could talk more about it. I just want to read a paragraph from the website blackallianceforpeace.com. It says, the Black Alliance for Peace has helped kick off a new effort demanding candidates for office to provide their position on war and militarism or militarization. It's called Anti-War Autumn, and it's designed to demonstrate public opposition to the permanent war agenda of the duopoly. Use the hashtag Anti-War Autumn on social media to help this campaign gain traction. So Julie just reminded us of that in the comments section. I mean, is there anything else? I felt like you described it.
Yeah, and then I mean, the more is that there's so much that goes into militarism, and then also anti-war autumn, because it's not a Black alliance. We're part of that campaign, and so we have to recognize that. So we did create with anti-war autumn. I was just told. So we did create it, but it also encompasses broader entities than ourselves. And so and it is also goes beyond just looking at Africa, as other places that are militarized and where the United States asserts its military power around the world. And so we are calling for the closing of all U.S. bases again, no matter where they are. We have the U.S. Out of Africa Shut Down AFRICOM campaign that specifically deals with Africa, because as Black people, this is it's a place where we came from and we have an interest tied there. But then we also recognize that there are military bases and military, I don't want to use the word adventures, but whatever it is, activities around other places in the world that we also oppose as humanists, as anti-imperialists, anti-war, pro-peace people. And anti-war autumn is designed to make this whole month, these months rather, plural, of fall, designed to lift up this this call, and also designed to make sure that the election season, or tries to increase the election seasons, what do you call it, looking at this as a campaign issue, as an issue for the elections. We're calling for the closure of all NATO bases as well. So not just U.S., because one thing the United States and works hand in hand with other Western forces, and they've established the North Atlantic Treaty Organization that is a military assertion around the world, and that we've even seen the destruction of Libya go hand in hand, be in partnership with between the United States, and the United States as a NATO partner and all these. So we're just like, this is, when we talk about imperialism, we're clear that imperialism is not just the United States, it's all of this, and that the component of imperialism is the militarization aspect that's facilitated through organizations like NATO.
Great. I think I want to plug in a couple, or let people know how they can help Black Alliance for Peace, as well as follow you on Twitter and any of the other work that you do. So we're talking with Netfa Freeman from Black Alliance for Peace. They just started a new campaign, U.S. out of Africa, shut down AFRICOM. But of course, this is Black Alliance for Peace. They focus on a whole array of issues that they work on that I think everyone should be informed about. Check them out at blackallianceforpeace.com. You can follow them on Twitter, the @ Blacks for Peace. You can follow, Netfa, you can plug your own Twitter if you want, and provide any way that people can get involved.
I'm on Twitter. I'm at Netfa Free, Netfa Free. And then and my organization, Pan-African Community Action, which is working on community control of police issues, and also as a member organization of Black Alliance for Peace, we're PACA DMV, at PACADMV, and also on Instagram.
Well, Netfa, I really appreciate this. I hope we can do this again in the near future, and keep fighting the good fight. I really appreciate the work that you and Black Alliance for Peace have been doing.
Thank you. Likewise, we appreciate your work too.